Hello everyone, this is part 5 of What If Naruto Had Wolverine's Powers. Enjoy! The medics had carried Sakura away minutes before, and the 13 genin remaining were standing before the statue once more. By some coincidence or design, each had at least one teammate nearby, and 3 complete teams had made it to the third exams tournament stage. As Hiruzen stood before them and cast a measuring gaze upon them, he was surprised to a degree. He'd been certain that Naruto would have made it this far, but for his teammates to do so as well, was an unexpected bonus. If there was a downside to the results, it would be that so few Konoha ninja made it this far, but he was content that those who stood here were the best genin available. The 13 of you who stand here are the very pinnacle of Shinobi, he said, with no preamble before his speech. Why waste the time? After he was done here, he was going to have to listen to the civilians on the council whine about the Uchiha's unfair treatment. How someone must have cheated to pull that match, or drugged their golden boy. They wouldn't understand the corruptive influence of that curse mark. Dragging his mind away from Sasuke's dilemma, he went on. As a result, you will be set against each other in the tournament in 1 month's time. This delay serves a dual purpose. First, it allows those important persons and officials who wish to attend time to arrive. They can see for themselves the quality of shinobi they are hiring for their tasks. The second reason, and far more relevant to yourselves, is that it allows you time to train and develop new techniques, or master old ones. As each of you has seen the others fight, with a few exceptions, here he thought of Naruto after his fight with Rock Lee, so you know something of your opponents. Now is the time for you to find something to surprise them, to show others that you are not stagnant and idle, but truly ready for the responsibilities that come with being Chunin. Your sensei await you, and I wish you good training. Dismissed. As the Hokage swept from the room, the ninja who were left found their way to their sensei and those teammates who hadn't needed medical attention or specialist assistance. Of those who had not advanced, Kiba was looking particularly lost, and his gaze kept slipping towards the Kumo team, who had all made the tournament, or rather, towards one particular member thereof. Hinata spotted the signs, and smiled. The poor boy was smitten, and had no idea how to deal with it. On top of that, one of his teammates was hospitalized, and the other was having his curse mark contained. If that was a manageable goal. He couldn't even turn to his sensei. A glance at Naruto, a nod, and she walked up to their Inuzuka friend. Kiba, we were going to go to Ichiraku's for ramen to celebrate our team making it this far. Would you like to join us, you and Akamaru? She asked politely. Kiba looked up at her, and shook his head. Nah, I've got some deep and heavy thinking ahead, some stuff I may even have to ask my ma about. I wouldn't be very good company, anyway. Tell you what, next time. He paused. He didn't want to say the words, my treat, because Naruto could literally eat his way through Kiba's savings easily. It was like saying, all you can eat, to Choji. I'll buy you guys a bowl. That said, he drifted away. Before anyone had the chance to leave, Gekko Hayate stepped up to the front of the dais, with a whiteboard set up and a box with a hole in the top that rattled. If I could get your attention, please, those who will be part of the tournament. In this box are a number of white balls with numbers from 1 to 13. As each of you draws one, your name goes next to that number and the next person draws. In this way we learn exactly who each of you will be facing in the first round of the tournament. The way things are arranged, one of you gets a free pass to the second round, and another, different person gets a pass to the third. Then the last 2 will face each other. Please bear in mind that all aspects of your performance will be judged, not just where you finish. There may be multiple Chunin, or none. Even those who have already been eliminated may yet be selected to be promoted, should their reports reflect them as deserving such a distinction. One by one, they drew out the numbers, and each name was slotted into place on the board. Tenten was the lucky one who drew 13, and received a pass in the first round, while Neji received the number 10. The Kumo team stepped forward next to draw, with Kura getting the 5, Suzume the 12 and Fukuro drew the 8. Then Odom and Tobu drew the 4 and 2 respectively, and it was Team 8's turn to draw. Shino looked at the ball in his hand. The 7. Hinata was nervous as Naruto drew the 3, and when she reached for her own, received the 9. When the Suna ninja received their numbers, Temari got the 6, Kankuro the 11, and Gaara received the 1. A few moments later, the lineups were completed. The match is set. Hayate looked over the genin before him. Now that we know who will be facing who, each of you should discuss your training for the next month with your sensei. Since you will be unavailable for missions or legal issues, unless you commit a crime, you will each receive pay as though for an ongoing C-rank mission. Good luck to you all. Kuranai was looking carefully at her genin, running things over in her mind. Their skills, as had been displayed in the preliminaries, were incredible, easily Chunin level, and Hinata's victory in particular had caused ripples in the Hyuga clan. This gentle storm she had developed was a devastatingly effective extension of the Hyuga techniques, but it was in a direction that most of the clan couldn't wield, so they would try to deny it. Talk about cutting off their nose to spite their face. She needed people who could teach her genin, who could help them reach the next level. Shino's father had delivered a message from his grandfather, acknowledging certain strides the young man had made in integrating his lightning chakra with his colony, and offering the youth a second colony, something only offered those the Aburame believed special, elite, and above all, capable. She certainly wasn't going to hold him back on that count. Naruto's teacher should have been an easy choice, but after the fight she'd seen, she had to wonder if there was anyone she knew short of a Sannin who could advance his skills, and Naruto had already encountered all three of those. In fact, maybe she should ask them. It had struck her for a moment as she pondered his fight with Lee, trying to spot a flaw in the whole thing that needed to be addressed, that she blanked as she realized. While Lee had removed his weights, Naruto had not. As for Hinata, the Hyuga would already have laid out a demand for their most accomplished warrior, Hiyashi himself, to help with Neji's training, and the man would comply, and he himself could not assist Hinata with her unique style, based off the same Hyuga style, but apparently far more dangerous. She needed someone with a lightning affinity to help her integrate it, and also someone who could help a newly developing style grow. Her best choice would be to contact Jiraiya for his aid, and let him take it from there, but first. Shinshi-kun, I have a tiny favor to ask of you. In return, I'll help your team with dealing with genjutsu. A man in a gray cloak, embroidered with a crane, and a wide hat, sat at the bar, nursing his sake. It didn't take long before he was joined by two others, a stocky man whose red cloak bore a willow tree and an older man, limping a little, bearing a peacock on his blue cloak. This one carried a bag beside him, and placed it on a stool next to them as he waved over a sake for himself. He measures up then? The crane-cloaked one asked. Of course, the willow-wearer stated. You remember Sarutobi Asuma, yes? He was assigned to Asuma's team as a Chunin assistant, and was so efficient at keeping them improving themselves that it became a habit. He even had Shikaku's boy doing sit-ups while he watched the clouds, if you can believe it. The peacock-clad man nodded. He even brought his team to be outfitted anew at my store as a form of consolation prize, he admitted. The youngest gentleman has done all that we have. He just needs to really show what he's capable of in a life or death situation. We're agreed, then? They each nodded, and then parted ways. It soon spread, it was official. The three gentlemen had accepted a fourth. Let me get this straight, the blonde woman spoke harshly with her old friend. You want me to go back to the village that claimed the lives of my brother and my fiancé, in order to train to kids who have a huge potential, one of which we know already. The other is a girl starting up her own style branching off from her family's, in order that they can take up the dream my loved ones died for. That killed Minato and Kushina, all because they deserve better than what the council would let them have or relegate them to. Jiraiya cringed as she put it that way. When you say it like that it sounds so bad. I'm sorry, I'll have to make other arrangements. The fist that wrapped itself in his kimono front and hauled him to her face had no business being so strong while not looking it. Ooh, no, you don't, she hissed at him. I wasn't saying no, I was just making sure I understood. Uzumaki versus Impossible. My money's on Uzumaki. It's the only time I win without a disaster waiting in the wings. Greetings, Uzumaki-sama, Hyuga-sama, the well-built bald man with the goatee said, his dark glasses hiding his eyes and his new green cloak, decorated with a tiger, billowing in the breeze. I am Sodaitora Shinshi, the gentleman tiger. I am here to assist the two of you with elemental integration, and learning the lightning element. He turned to Naruto. Sadly, I can help little with the fire element, I have only earth, wind and lightning. But what I teach, you will learn. Naruto and Hinata exchanged a glance as the older shinobi took out a scroll and a brush. The first step would be to increase the effectiveness of your weight training. Now this is a gravity seal with a factor of 2. In the Hyuga compound, Hiyashi worked with Neji, giving the young man a solid and unbreakable grip on the foundations of the gentle fist, while his nephew's teammate was trained in no small way by her adopted father. He was starting to wonder about them, though, as they would disappear together in the afternoons, to reappear much later, flushed and sweating, almost exhausted. There were a few other activities he could imagine that would have two teenagers in such a state, he was certain, but for some reason, he couldn't think of any off the top of his head. They seemed to enjoy that time, he supposed, and he would like Neji to be happy, but perhaps next time he should follow them, just to make sure they knew what they were getting into. Sasuke glared in the mirror. A third ring of seals had been inked into place around this curse mark, apparently meant to seal it away. They wouldn't work. They hadn't worked the first time, and those seals had been set by a master, the Sannin called Jiraiya. In the entire history of Konoha, only 2 others had surpassed him with Fuinjutsu, and neither of those were alive. It was an odd trio that presented themselves in the Hokage's office. The blonde looked to be in her mid-30s at the oldest, the brunette carrying the pig was in her 20s, and the white-haired old man was easily in his 50s or 60s. All 3 carried themselves like shinobi, and all 3 bowed low. As requested, Hokage-sensei, we are here to assist in the training of Uzumaki Naruto. Sarutobi Hiruzen smiled a genuine smile, something that, apart from occasional cameos on his face at some amusing thing Naruto had managed, had been absent from his expressions for far too long. Welcome home, Tsunade-san. So Naruto was all it took to get you home then? I wish I'd known this earlier, I'd have had him write to you, as soon as I taught him to write. He rose and came around the desk to hug his former student. You have really been gone far too long. Let me tell you what that boy has done so far, especially his mission to Nami no Kuni, and how well he's done in the Chunin exams. Tsunade went pale as she remembered the exact words on a very old bet she'd had with Naruto. Chunin exams? He's in line to be a Chunin, now, is he? Her gaze drifted to Jiraiya, who nervously cleared his throat. I knew something had slipped my mind, he said. Apparently he's done quite well, a very strong young man, and that's why he and his fiancée need your training. Too late, the Toad Sage knew he'd just slipped up again. Fiancé? Dear Jiraiya-san, please do tell me how a young boy gets engaged and you forget to tell me about it. Tsunade's voice ran up and down from growls to purrs, and Jiraiya felt the deep subconscious beast within him and all men crawl under his metaphorical bed and hide, muttering, "You're on your own," over and over. Coming clean sounded like a very good idea. Shimura Danzo was not a happy man, less so now that the Uchiha was out of the running for the tournament. Looking around the table at the other counselors, he opened his mouth, only to be cut off by the Hokage. Not a word, Danzo, Hiruzen almost snarled. With such venom even his old teammates were taken aback. With the migraine masquerading as a Chunin exams that you insisted Hitaki Kakashi nominate his team for, if you say one word about his not being given a fair chance, I will, by the 1001 kami, nail you to this table and let Ibiki and Inoichi at you. The council was silent, although most of the shinobi half of the council was impressed. The Yamanaka head even looked over at Danzo, almost a challenge in itself. Go ahead, that look seemed to say, I dare you. And I will enjoy ripping your secrets from your mind. Danzo, quite prudently, remained silent. Hiruzen glared at the agenda for today's meeting. HMPH. Let's see what you have in your heads today. First item, the obvious railroading of the preliminaries and the defrauding of Uchiha Sasuke of his place in the tournament. Hiruzen looked over at the civilian side of the council. You do realize you have no jurisdiction over military decisions, right? That you could be charged for even attempting it? At the nervous glances, he saw that they weren't reading the laws they were trying to use against him properly. Someone had given them that most dangerous of things, a little information. Clearing his throat, he spoke. First item denied. As Danzo opened his mouth to protest, Hiruzen pointed at him. Not one word, all meeting, or else. Turning the page, Hiruzen continued. Application to invoke the Clan Registration Act, on behalf of Uzumaki Naruto, whose signature is not affixed, and the potential brides. Aren't these the very girls who used to spit on him before his abduction? You've failed to include his current fiancée, and another thing that you've missed. Here he smirked. He is currently enlisted in the Chunin exams, and stands a good chance of promotion. His finger was pointing at Danzo before the old warhawk could even think of opening his mouth this time. Although Haruno Mebuki stood in protest, Uzumaki-sama has Kekkei Genkei that are valuable to Konoha. It is imperative that such not be lost through random blending with other bloodlines, and as the boy in question is not yet of age, and is a genin, he falls under civilian jurisdiction for this purpose. Her lecture was piercing, and Inuzuka Sume was holding her ears by the end of the declamation. Hyuga Hiyashi raised his hand. Hokage-sama, if I may. At Hiruzen's wave of invitation, he stood. Mebuki-san, you are operating with a flawed premise. Uzumaki Naruto is under consideration for promotion to Chunin, a state that carries with it legal majority, as such ninja have proven themselves to deserve it. Since he is within such consideration as part of the Chunin exams, he is currently beyond all legal actions until his status is resolved, save those that apply to criminal activity against Konoha. Should he, as is likely, achieve the rank of Chunin, he will then have the right to declare or deny this CRA for himself. Introducing this in such a manner is thus illegal, although I am sure Hokage-sama can forgive such a thing. Once. It was a much paler Mebuki who dropped into her seat, and glared in Danzu's direction, as Hiruzen made another announcement. Second item, denied. Third item. He turned another page. This meeting, he was beginning to agree with the Nara clan. So troublesome. The Kumo genin occupied a tree set a small distance from the walls of the Hyuga estate, looking towards that compound. Their guards are good, no openings there, Kura said to his teammates. Going over the wall won't work, and the girl is too well protected on her way to and from their academy. This is a strategic nightmare. The luck of the draw, I guess. Suzume slapped him with her sketchbook, before returning to her landscape of the area. You know I hate that phrase, Kura ni, she told her surrogate, big brother, never mind the fact that she was older than he. What about that house? Kura shook his head. Hardly. That Uzumaki lives there, and we all saw him fight. Could any of us have taken that hit and just shaken it off like that? Bad strategy to tick off someone that good. Suzume nodded absently. This is a terrible idea, too, Raikage's orders or not. The target he ordered is the sister of that Hyuga girl from the first preliminary. You saw what she did? I'm starting to doubt Arcage's sanity. What do you think, Fukuro-chan? She looked back at her sister. They weren't related, any of them, except by circumstance, all being orphans taken in by the goodness of Kumogakure no Sato's collective heart. And if you believed that, she had a bridge in Nami she wanted to sell you. While Kura's last name was now kind of cool, it hadn't been that long ago that it had been the same as theirs. Nusuma, stolen, a dead giveaway. Her sister in all but blood, however, was not paying attention. She was instead staring dreamily in completely the wrong direction, towards a young man with scruffy black hair and a small white dog. Fukuro realized slowly that her team wanted something from her. If they build them like him, this place can't be all that bad, can it? The giggles of Suzume told her that answer had nothing to do with her question. Kura rolled his eyes. Enough recon, time for practice. Another axe haft shattered in the pale girl's grip as her sensei coached her. She was getting better, she knew, but still she sighed as she cast it aside. I don't think weapons are the answer, Ishiguma-sensei. She corrected herself at his glare. Tu-san, sorry, indeed not. The voice of her adoptive father, the stone bear of Iwa, was like someone trying to gargle gravel. But it has given you the control you need for the Dreambreaker Jutsu. Now, gather your chakra. So, Naruto stared at Jiraiya. When Tsunade-sama had arrived, and offered to help train Hinata. He'd taken it as a godsend, and Jiraiya's offer to teach him at the same time was almost as welcome. The two of them had learned much from Shinshi, but he had his own team to teach, and while Kurenai could help them with genjutsu and breaking them, Naruto was unlikely to be able to use such. He was even excited to hear about the whole summons contract concept. But this, you want me to summon toads and frogs? He asked, to be sure he'd heard correctly. Yeah, it'll be great, the old man said, caught up in the thought, your dad could do it. I taught him how, and now you, too, can hold the Toad Mountain contract. Naruto shrugged off the feelings of pride about his dad, as he needed more reasons to be proud of him, and crossed his arms. So you want me to summon creatures that would see my teammate as a snack? You do recall that Shino's an Aburame, right? The look on the old Sanin's face informed Naruto that Jiraiya had indeed forgotten. What other summons are there? Kakashi has the Dog Plains contract, Sunade and Shizune the Slug Marsh, that Anko girl has the Serpent River, and the Hokage has the Monkey Jungle one. There are others, but those are the main ones. Jiraiya shook his head. I've even heard rumors that the female Aburame have been keeping the Mantis Ridge contract hidden. Is there a Fox contract? Jiraiya's eyebrow rose. Not that I know of, kid, he replied. I suppose if you had a powerful enough creature, you could make one, but you also have to find the associated location for the creatures you summon, and that goes in the contract's name. If a contract signatories all die, then the next person to summon that creature has to start from scratch. Naruto thought hard as he ruminated on Jiraiya's words. So what should I learn in the meantime, he asked. I've got 3 weeks and as many shadow clones as I can make, so let me see what you can teach me. Hinata stared as the fish flopped and thrashed, and Shizune threw the poor thing back into the water. Whoa, the older Kunoichi said as the magnitude of what she'd witnessed sank in. I didn't get it down that fast. Sunade, maybe we should recruit some Hyuga for the Medi Nin Corps? The medic of the Sanin nodded. Hinata may not have had huge reserves of power, but she did have superlative chakra control, and the Byakugan was a major benefit to the things she was learning. Add in the gentle storm style she was developing. Naruto was just lucky he was already engaged to her, because once her abilities became known, the poor girl would have been part of some bidding war to gain her as a bride to improve her own or another's clan. Yamanaka Inoichi slugged back the bottle of sake, much to the surprise of his friends. As Shikaku and Shuza stared, the blonde Jonin gestured for 2 more. Hinata and Naruto came in for therapy today, he said. After the bottle, he was feeling a little buzzed, but he was still far too sober for his own liking. I was there to do the assessment to see if my wife could look through their minds without running into S-class secrets. Hinata's mind isn't too bad, just nightmares of failing Naruto. Hiyoshi's attitude while growing up, she's seen worse. But Naruto, the sake arrived and he slugged back another, before pouring from the 3rd bottle. I can't in good conscience let another wade through what I encountered in that poor young man's head. Shikaku caught the way his friend spoke of the 13-year-old, who was no doubt training hard at that very moment. He remembers the experiments they did on him, you know? He has a terror that they'll come for him, or worse, as far as he's concerned, for Hinata. And that was bad enough, but the way he lived, the way he was treated, before he was abducted. More sake disappeared into the Mind Walker's belly. His passenger is in there, too, fully aware, and that one enjoys scaring the spit out of people. He even gave me a guided tour of Naruto's mind, including the things our own children did. You too can be proud of your boys, but Ino, I have to talk with Ino. He pushed away from the bar and left, shaking a little, but otherwise stone cold sober. Something he should not have been, having consumed as much sake as he had. Ino sat in the stands with her parents, gazing out at the assembled hopefuls and listening to the gossip below. 2 weeks ago, her father had asked her permission to examine certain memories, so that he had the context for the actions she'd taken. Puzzled, she hitchhiked with him as he plunged into her mind, and looked closely at everything she'd ever done or said, to Naruto. She'd wondered why, as she saw the past rise up once more, and seen exactly what she'd done, how she'd slapped down any attempt at friendship by this dirty, badly clad orphan. What ninja wears orange unless they're a fool or decoy? She'd seen the other kids do worse than taunt, she'd seen the bruised and battered Naruto, and once she'd even witnessed the beating he took because he wouldn't give that bully from the basic school his real name, instead calling him Hajime, under the logic, well, you're always starting fights. She was not proud of her past self, nor was she looking forward to the lecture she was certain that she'd receive from her father, one she felt she actually deserved, and what teenage girl ever thinks that? Then her father found something she'd suppressed, an almost forgotten memory from years ago. She'd found a really badly beaten Naruto in the park, where he'd been left by whoever beat him, with a welt on his forehead from an adult's hand, as that Hyuga girl, Hinata, was dragged away by an insensitive carer. If such an oxymoron could exist. The bullies had left, laughing, and she'd wanted to avoid the boy, but she'd heard his belly growl loudly. One rice ball, one single, solitary morsel, that she'd been saving as a treat for herself for the walk home. Yet when she saw this boy, having heard the Hyuga girl's words, she left it for him instead, not understanding why. She wasn't sure why even now, years after the event. So she retreated from her own mind, and opened her eyes. Her father's sudden embrace was shocking. She was expecting a lecture, deserved one in her own eyes, yet for some reason, that one memory, that single rice ball, had affected her normally cheerfully stoic father, like this. She had barely made out his voice as he spoke. I have seen Naruto's side of these events, too, he'd whispered. I'm not happy with your behavior. But that rice ball, he never knew who left it for him, but he remembered it. You didn't give it to him to get anything. There was no possible gain for you. You left it because it was the right thing to do. That makes me proud of you. The stands rang with the noise of the crowd, and she pushed her introspection away to watch her former classmates perform. In the arena, a good 20 feet below the stands, the sickly proctor stood side by side with his assistants, a woman with long purple hair and a man with a long grass stem in his mouth. All three wore swords, and Gekko Hayate stepped forward holding out the sheet that had the matchups arrayed on it. Take a quick look at this, he said, and refresh your memory on who your first fight is against. Those of you not in the first match are to go up the stairs behind that door. Here he pointed to a doorway in the walls of the stadium, to the waiting area for the contestants. As the participants not fighting moved quickly from the field, Hiruzen looked over to the case cage on the next throne over. At least, he thought it was the case cage. He couldn't be certain with that veil over the man's face, and he himself had never met the man. So why did he seem so familiar? Your son is in the first match, I see, he said, attempting to draw the man into conversation. That is not my son, the case cage said in an indistinct voice. I do pity the Iwa boy's bad luck. Quietly and furiously, the man behind the mask had other thoughts. I hope that Gaara's bloodthirst doesn't go too far, that could ruin the whole plan. 1. Sabaku no Gaara vs 2. Tamaishi Tobu. Tobu knew what he was getting into in this match. He'd seen the reports of aftermaths where Gaara had been involved against Iwa ninja. They weren't pretty. Still, he felt he was tougher and stronger than most. He should have a chance, particularly with his facility with Earth Jutsu. As he took his stance, the one called Gaara simply stood there, his arms crossed. The hail of stones from Tobu's first jutsu, intended to test the waters, so to speak, were slapped aside contemptuously by tendrils of sand that sprang up from the ground. Sand that was even now slowly pouring from the gourd on the other boy's back. Gaara was measuring the heavily muscled young man in the white outfit. The rocks were mildly interesting, and the wave of dirt that he shockwaved towards Gaara stopped dead when it hit a counter wave of sand. This was boring, and Mother cried out for blood. Tobu stepped up, right at the edge of Gaara's sand, his hands flickering through an array of hand seals before he plunged them into the sand. Doden. Terrain domination. He cried out as he unleashed the chakra to make this sand answer to his will instead of his foes. It came as a great surprise, therefore, as the sand did not release his hands when he tried to stand, but instead held him firm, beginning to spiral up his arms and cover him as Gaara finally lifted one hand towards him. Sand coffin, came the harsh whisper, and Tobu's heart dropped in his chest. He could guess what came next, and the last thing he saw was his friend Koshi, in the stand screaming Tobu's name, as the sand covered his face. Sand burial. As the sand covering the larger genin turned red with a terrible sound, Gaara sighed with an expression suspiciously like relief, and Temari relaxed a little. The plan was still good. Gaara had just taken the edge off his bloodlust, and it wasn't like Iwa could hate him anymore. Odom watched what was left of her teammate drip slowly through the sand, and as Gaara pulled the blood-soaked sand back to his gourd, releasing the crushed and ruined thing that had once been Tobu, a young man filled with laughter and knowledge, she wondered why she still couldn't cry. She could sorrow, she could mourn, but no tears ever came. Recalling the matchups, she quirked one corner of her mouth upward, while her brow settled in a grim demeanor. She simply had to win her next match, and she could drag her friend's equivalent value from this Gaara's flesh. 3. Uzumaki Naruto vs 4. Dairaseki Odom. Odom walked slowly to the center of the field, taking up her stance and freezing in place. Today's events were such that Tusan, Ishiguma-sensei, had provided her with a new outfit, one in a flattering blue, with leggings and sleeveless jacket. The kanji for bear, written in black on her back loudly proclaimed his pride for her. Her sensei, her father, watched from the stands high above, smiled, and turned to regard the poor fool who'd been pitted against her. As the young genin stepped from the shadows of the doorway he froze. It couldn't be, he was too young and the man who'd taken his eye was dead for at least 13 years now. It struck him that this must be the son of that man, the legacy of the Yondaime Hokage, the Yellow Flash. Naruto had deliberately chosen his outfit for today with care, and some advice from his Hinata. The pants and jacket were, as always, orange, but striped across the legs and arms in black. He wore a coat, like he remembered from that echo of his father, seen so long ago, almost 4 years now, but this coat was black, with orange flames about the hem, and the lack of sleeves revealed his jacket's crests, the white spiral on his left shoulder and the red spiral on his right. Beneath the coat, seen occasionally as it snapped and billowed around him, the character for Fukutsu, or fortitude, was prominently displayed in midnight blue over his heart. From a strap across his chest, a large scroll nestled on his back. All 3 members of Team 8 had one, and each was different. His and Hinata's looked new. He took his own stance, feet wide, body low, arms forward with the backs of his fists toward the ground and about level with his shoulders, and waited, an almost feral grin of anticipation on his face. This should be interesting. Hajime, called Hayate, and the fight began, Odom moving towards Naruto in a veritable maelstrom of fists, feet, elbows and knees, a blizzard of strikes that he was hard put to fend off. Yet he did. A strike that should have taken off his head slid along his jaw with no real contact, a knee to his ribs instead fell short as he moved. Then she saw it, a fraction of a second with an opening as she spun around his arms, pushing his fists in that direction and drove her elbow into his neck at the base of the skull with truly punishing force, hearing a metallic ratcheting noise as her opponent cartwheeled over to crash down on his back, and disappear in a puff of white smoke. She snarled, but she was impressed. She'd just given him a crash course in her fighting style, at minimal cost, and now he knew about the deceptively vicious reverse elbow. To make things even more interesting, her elbow was throbbing. He was. Wait, my elbow is throbbing? But I never feel anything. Her eyes unwillingly drifted to her arm as she worked her stony fingers about the joint. She could feel the pressure she was causing, but little more, until she brushed against the point of impact. The sudden sensation had her hissing, a sharp, indrawn breath. That actually hurt. Whatever he was made of, this fight was now something she could really enjoy. This boy could make her feel. If she could find him. There he was, on that branch, the one that bowed a little in a manner she found familiar, a hint that the person on the branch was far heavier than they looked. As she watched, he bit his thumb and reached inside his jacket to swipe at something on his chest. Fuinjutsu. Go Juryoku Fuji. Release, he called out, and stepped from the branch, which snapped upwards to the nearly vertical once relieved of its burden. As he hit the ground, she was already in motion, her barrage of attacks overwhelming in number, for anyone else. Naruto felt much lighter with the 5 gravity seal released, although according to Shinshi, this being one of the 2 seals the gentleman tiger had managed to teach him and Hinata, the other being far less practical in combat. All he had to do was wipe off the blood and run chakra through the seal once more to restore it. As the Iwa Kunoichi came in, he saw the pattern his shadow clone had been hard-pressed against, and countered it, hammering each of her strikes with a striking surface of his own, plated with bone metal. She was feeling those, they were hurting her, he could tell. So why was she smelling ever more eager for this fight? Ishiguma Daikenshi watched from the stands. Were it not for the reserve the stone bear style had inculcated in him, he would have been beside himself, without using any bunshin techniques. His daughter was having the fight of her life down there, and feeling it, the pain was obvious in her face. The fact that she was feeling it had him worried. Having found pain, would she seek out more? Or would she seek out other feelings? All he could do was be there, and pray. Breaking away as Naruto struck a counter blow at the moment she spun for the reverse elbow, driving her to one knee which she turned into a roll as she tumbled forwards to reach a standing position. And spinning to face her foe, she saw him charging towards her, and channeled chakra into her body for the stone bear techniques Ishiguma had drilled her in. The first stage was easy, to her anyway, the hardened body of stone bear. The second was less so, pouring the chakra through the muscles instead of the chakra coils. To anyone who hadn't mastered the first step, this could tear their muscles from the very bones, but if you had, you instead increased your strength immensely with the iron bear. She absently tore a nearby tree from the ground and swung it at her blue-eyed foe. When Naruto saw her tear the tree from the ground like she was picking a daisy, he hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but she swung the tree at him and he had a split second to counter. As his claws shot out of his forearms, he was already channeling wind chakra into them, and he struck at the tree, screaming out, "Kase no Sume! Claws of the wind," as he did. The results were twofold, both halting the tree's swing and severing the upper half from the trunk, sending it crashing to the ground, even as the crowd began to roar with applause at the fight unfolding here. Raising his arms before him, crossed over his chest, Naruto grinned at his opponent, who was debating whether or not her current techniques were good enough. Channeling lightning chakra into the claws at the same time as his wind chakra was a little tricky, but the hum that started to emerge from them as the girl's eyes widened was ominous. She released a storage scroll at her hip and caught the Zanbatsu, the horse-killing sword, that emerged. Raising it with both hands, she shouted, a wordless yell of challenge, and charge. To Naruto, it was close to slow motion, as he swept his claws to cross, intercepting her descending sword, designed to cleave through a horse in a single blow, armored or not, in a manner similar to the way he'd done against Zabuza. This time, though, he knew what he was doing, and how, thanks to Shinshi-san, and wasn't about to pass out. He roared, Arashi no Sume, and the hum of his claws intensified, and the Kumo ninja stared as they recognized the sound of Raiden pouring through a blade as Naruto's claws sliced through the tempered steel with all the resistance of water, and hammering his forehead against the Iwa girl's hite-8, driving her from her feet, before releasing his grip on his chakra and sheathing his claws. Ishiguma landed in the arena, staring down at his unconscious daughter. This Uzumaki, didn't the Flash have that redhead girlfriend with that name? This was making more and more sense. He gathered his child and student up, her soft flesh dimpling. The stone bear of Iwa paused. Otom's skin was now soft and pink, and he glanced up at the boy. No, the ninja. Who'd given her the fight of her life, who shrugged. Wondering at the miracle, he decided to speak with Koshi. Iwa would not learn of this young man through them. Naruto returned to the participants' seats, claiming the one next to Hinata, as he redid his gravity seal. He answered Hinata's questioning look with a smile. That style had almost no openings, he explained, and I didn't think anyone made of stone could be that fast. It was constant offense. I wonder if Lee could use it? The announcement of the next match drew their attention back to the stadium floor. 5. Sabaku no Tamari vs 6. Ginkumo Kura. Kura had, like so many others, been somewhat gobsmacked by the fight between the two previous genin. He didn't let it overwhelm him though, just gave his thanks that he hadn't been the unlucky number 4. As he skated down the wall on his chakra, a skill he'd discovered himself from the tree climbing exercise. It was a simple matter of cycling the chakra, letting it pull you along, and what he did now was a slightly reversed version. With his chakra used to slow his descent, his mind raced on 5 different paths. The first part, the quietest, was analyzing the previous battle. The second, a little louder, was running through the known tactics of his opponent and possible counters. A wind user was seriously challenging, she could deflect his weapons virtually at will, and was good at maintaining mid to long range distances. Third, he was pondering over a mystery that had come to light very recently. Occasionally, they lost their sensei. He would disappear, and be gone for a few hours. Was Sagi-sensei's loyalty to Kumo as solid as the Raikage believed, or was he being recruited by Konoha? Fourth, Kura was pondering his, and his, sister's, origins. None of them really looked the part, and there were no other owl-partnered clans in Kaminari no Kuni. Should they be as loyal, considering the suicide mission that the Raikage had given them, kidnap a main branch Hyuga? They'd heard horror stories of what had happened the last time. They'd gotten a body to study, but someone from Konoha had been generous, and also given them some free explosive seals on the body as well. As Kumo seemed to believe? He doubted it, they were seen as worthless and expendable, it seemed. It was his 5th train of thought though, that was most prominent in his awareness. Did he want to win? If he won against this Tamari, he'd have proven his strategies, yes, but the girl herself seemed somewhat distracted, and only truly relaxed once her brother had killed someone. He would also then have to fight this Uzumaki, and if the name wasn't enough of a warning to leave him be, his performance against Iwa's Marble Maiden was. He found himself in his customary pose, balanced on one foot on a kunai, facing the Suna Kunoichi who held her fan over one shoulder. But the perfect strategy was right there in front of him, with a vast number of contingencies and an insane amount of flexibility. He just hoped he had the means to pull this off. Tamari moved as soon as the Kumo genin did, her fan deflecting his kunai away while it remained closed, then swung open to sever the trailing wire with the chakra-sharpened edge. "You won't catch me like that," she boasted, as she returned the favor with a blast of wind that hammered where Kura had been seconds earlier, the young man having slid away on the wire standing taut between the kunai he'd stood on, and another he'd thrown while she deflected the one aimed at her. A quick glance around revealed the kunai, and numerous connecting wires, all around, although being tight stretched between the arrayed kunai, she didn't believe they could be used to trap her. That odd trick he used to slide along the wires could get annoying, though, and she grabbed one of the kunai to disrupt the web of wires. A blinding light and deafening crack later and she was lying against the stadium wall, twitching as she fought to stand. A calm voice spoke next to her, level, but amused. "What do you think of my jutsu?" Kura asked the Suna Kunoichi. "I call it my lightning step technique. It gives me mobility, and I get to defend myself from anyone fool enough to touch the web. It's going to take a while for your nervous system to realign, so." He reached out with a red marker and drew a line across her throat. "I win, I guess. Don't feel too bad. It's just the luck of the draw." In the cage's box, the case cage didn't even twitch. "Another failed tool," he murmured. Was this alliance really worth it? Perhaps if he got the Ichibi another way? No, it was too late to change the plan now. He'd just have to hope that Kabuto could get that Uchiha for him in the confusion. 7. Aburame Shino vs 8. Nusuma Fukuro. The Aburame seats were filled. The men and women of the clan had gathered to show their support of their young representative, and so sat clustered around his parents and his young sister, too young for her first colony. Shibi and Hotaru kept their eyes on their son, the first male Aburame in generations to be permitted to sign the Mantis Ridge summoning contract. Shino, for his part, didn't seem bothered by the surveillance of his performance. His coat had been replaced, a longer, better cut one had been given to him, and the staff he'd once used replaced with some new weapons that the Kamakiri Kaseki herself had taught him to use. Between the greatcoat, his sunglasses and his Aburame reserve, it was nearly impossible to tell what he was thinking. The scroll across his back didn't detract from, but rather accented, the image he now gave. Fukuro looked at him as she performed the same merger trick she had used at the preliminaries, and as the two owl girls launched into the sky, Shino sighed. He thrust his hands forward, and his new weapon sprang from his sleeves to his hands, the Naijuten Kamakiri. Tenten drooled a little when she saw them, the folded steel elegant in its unmarked simplicity. The blades were similar to those of katanas, but they curved forwards from the hilt, and were only sharp on that inside edge. The blades suddenly turned a dull gray as they were surrounded by stone, and it was quickly obvious that Shino was pouring earth chakra into them, as his Kakaichu colonies spread out in a cloud, crackling as lightning sprang from bug to bug, and Shino took a stance and froze. The blades of his swords were angled down, edge in, with his hands at shoulder height, and his elbows level with his ribs. His feet were wide set and firmly planted, and his eyes were closed. Shirahime and Fukuro circled silently as Shino waited, and waited, and waited, expressing nigh infinite patience as he stood there. Fukuro continued to circle. At first glance she thought Shino's stance to be full of openings, but Shirahime apparently felt differently, so the part avian Kunoichi had stepped back, so to speak, and begun a more detailed scrutiny, one that chilled her. He wasn't using his ears to sense his surroundings. Somehow he was using that cloud of insects. Well, there was something she could do about that. Signaling her partner, she began to climb, and she started her swoop at the same instant that Shirahime used her wings to start the futon. Great breakthrough. As the gust of wind forced a wide swath through the cloud of beetles, she was already moving fast, and her silent wings gave her the edge in an area devoid of insects. So why was he moving? The spark that flickered across in front of her was the last clue. His Kakaichu weren't there to detect anything, they were a decoy from the real detection method, the spark net he'd set them to build, so he could spot when she attacked. Mentally, she kicked herself for spending more time drooling over her last opponent than training to meet this one. As the stone-covered blades hit, she was driven from consciousness and the match was done. Polite applause from the Hyuga and Aburame seats surprised many, but Shino merely smiled behind his high collar as he put away his swords. 9. Hyuga Hinata vs 10. Hyuga Neji. As Neji strode to the center of the stadium, his cousin trailing in his wake, as she was fated to do, a niggling moment of doubt surfaced. She had gotten this far after all, and that thought could not and would not be dismissed so easily. Nor could the thought of what she had managed in the preliminaries. Her corrupted version of the gentle fist had taken down another ninja, but surely the pure version would triumph, wouldn't it? He ran his Byakugan across his cousin, taking in her leggings, shirt, and that dratted jacket she prized like a blasted engagement ring. As he took the stance that was so familiar, the unstoppable gentle fist, he smirked. He could do this. Hinata stared at her cousin, trying hard to resist the fear that was there inside her. She'd never beaten Hanabi before, her self-doubt kept saying, so how could she beat Neji? Another voice, that sounded a lot like her Naru-kun's, was screaming encouragement at her, though, pushing her forwards to show all that she could do. But I have to fight Neji ni-san. What if I can't beat him? There was a pause as if not even her inner voice could answer that, and then she heard her Naru-kun whisper softly. Then you learn from it, pick yourself up and try again. Isn't that part of our Nindo? The Hyuga stands were silent. The elders of course supported Neji's traditional style over Hinata's new one, but Hiyashi had seen something there that they'd missed. The gentle fist was a rigid, defined and codified style that relied on a particular set of maneuvers, where the gentle storm seemed to adapt to the defenses raised against it, constantly changing. As Hayate called, Hajime, Neji struck first, but with words rather than blows. Fate has decreed you lose today, he said, firmly, and I am just its instrument to put you in your place. After all, how can you win? You have been weak so long, and just because some loser decided to take advantage of your naive and soft-hearted nature, you run to his side and call it victory. You are weak still, and he is a monster to do this. As Neji began, at first Hinata felt he was right, and if he'd stuck to insulting her, it could have ended differently, as Hinata had been conditioned to believe that she could not defeat her family. But when his target drifted to Naruto, Hinata quietly bit her thumb and reached inside her jacket, swiping as she murmured a release similar to Naruto's Fuinjutsu, Sanjuryoku Fuji, release. As Neji called her beloved Naru-kun a monster, she disappeared from sight only to reappear behind him, striking for his tenketsu. Kaden, he yelled, performing the rotation defense that surprised almost everyone present, as it was considered an exclusively main house skill. Tenten's whoop of joy and triumph informed Hiyashi that the pair's periods of absence had not been for typical teenage reasons. As Neji slowed, a spiraling circle of disturbed ground around him, Hinata was there, just beyond it, unhurt, and rushed in again, resulting in a second Kaden, before Neji noticed something. Both times, she had not channeled her chakra to her hands. Now she did, melding wind and water and lightning. That wasn't good. She was there, right in front of him, as he entered the famous gentle fist attack, taking it further than anyone knew he could. 8 trigrams, 128 palms. He struck with incredible precision and speed, but wherever he hit, she wasn't there, always just a fraction beyond his reach. Neji-san, she said as his furious assault ceased, for the first time since she'd met him, dropping the knee from his honorific, which actually frightened him a little. You talk too much. Her response to him was brutal, swift and merciless. When he struck for her tenketsu again, she met the strike with her own, catching his fingers on her palm. Gentle storm. Chakra shockwave. As her power rippled up his arm, the wind element ravaging his chakra coils along the path the water element created, and the lightning element dancing along his nerves in its wake, his entire arm simply failed him. There was no control, no style or discipline, no grace, as it simply dropped, useless, to his side, pulling him a fraction off balance, and her second strike hit his opposite leg, carrying him to the floor. Struggling, he went to reopen his tenketsu with his other hand, but Hinata had it in her grip. I wouldn't, she said, firmly but gently. You need to see Sunade-sama to deal with this damage. Trying to reopen them without mending the chakra coils would give you limited use, but then it would burn those coils out for good. Neji went white. If you hadn't insulted Naruto-kun, the Hyuga girl went on as the medics approached and Hayate declared the winner, you might have beaten me. But you did. He isn't a monster, Ni-san. He freed you, and the rest of the branch house, and you still see something he isn't. He has suffered, but he took strength from it and flew. You chose to be a bird, huddled in a cage that had no door, too scared to fly. Maybe now we can throw away the cage. Orochimaru was inwardly cursing. His disguise was ridiculously hot, his carefully manipulated puppets were failing him, and to top it all off, Kabuto still hadn't given the signal. He needed more time. Kankuro. His match was next, so a single gesture to tell him to extend it as long as possible. Kankuro caught the signal, absorbed its meaning and nodded even as the proctor called for the next matchup. Unfortunately, what neither had considered, as obvious as it may have been, was the differences in signal language between Konoha and Suna. 11. Sabaku no Kankuro vs 12. Nusuma Suzume. As Suzume began to head towards the stairs, Kankuro put together a rationale, both a public one, and one related to his family's secret mission, for what his father had told him to do. A single, no, signal like that, he knew since his father had taught him this, meant he should throw the match, so obviously they needed to keep his puppet's new capabilities hidden, which in turn meant they would need them soon. He leaned over the rail and called out, Proctor, I forfeit this match. I have no real defenses against a genjutsu user of this girl's caliber, so this match would be a waste of precious time. The tiny Kumo girl looked up at him, then calmly pulled out her sketchbook, found the page with his picture on it and drew a red circle and line across it. Then she returned to the contestants' waiting area. In the cage's box, Orochimaru resisted the urge to drive his face into his palm, barely. Tenten stared. She didn't have to face anyone in this round, so she had been studying everyone as they fought, and looked carefully at those who won. She had a good eye for weapons, and had perked up when she saw the Zanbatsu, and even more at the sight of Shino's weapons. Shino had even been willing to let her see them even closer. Before the second round was to begin, the new lineup was tallied and had to be announced, and caterers had already begun to deliver the midday meals. Looking around, she wished Neji had still been here. She saw Naruto and Hinata sharing their meal, a large bento that Hinata had brought and a few cups of instant ramen. She blinked as Shino sat near them eating, sharing some portion of his meal with his Kakaichu. That meant all of Team 8 had made it this far. That was a shock. Few teams managed that in any Chunin exams, especially as rookie genin. The announcement came as Gecko Hayate spoke into a microphone. Luckily the sickly Jonin hadn't tried to clear his throat, or they might have been there all day. Lords, ladies, Kage and other observers and Shinobi. Cough if I can direct your attention to the large board at the end of the stadium. The results and new matchups have been determined. Sure enough, the board displayed the next round's fights, and the matchups were easily seen. As the winner of the first match, Gaara got a free pass into the third round, something he seemed somewhat upset by. Glaring at anyone who came close, he stalked over to the rail where he sat on a stool made of sand that came from his gourd. The first match was to be Naruto, and he was facing the Kumo genin called Kura, who seemed at least as good a strategist as Shikamaru. A challenge for the Konoha Jinchuriki, but not an insurmountable one. The second match was Shino against Hinata, something that Team 8 had seen coming. Looking at the board also told them that it was very possible that Naruto and Hinata could be fighting each other, not an event that the couple were looking forward to. The last match of the second round was much less controversial, with Tenten facing the Kumo Genjutsu genin, Suzume. Looking at each other, Team 8, the only intact team to reach this point, nodded, and put their left fists together. Naruto led off. We seek and scout, and fight with our very lives for those we love, he intoned, a solemn note in his voice that their fellow genin, even Gaara, took note of and looked around to see what they were doing. We are Team 8, and we are one. Hinata took up the chant. We aid and protect, and our strength is others as much as our own, she said, equally solemn. We are Team 8, and we give our all. Shino spoke next. The solemn tone seemed to fit him far better than the other two. We scatter and swarm, and give of ourselves for each other. We are Team 8, and we keep our word. Together they finished it. We are strong alone, and stronger together, and that strength grows by the hour. We are Team 8, and we always will be. Finally, they lowered their hands and nodded to each other. Not that far away, Kakashi heard them, and smiled. He was sitting with Team 7, who had also heard the declaration. Team 8 didn't seem to be trying to keep it secret, anyway, so a number of people, including the various judges and proctors, heard it. And beneath his mask, the copycat ninja smiled. If those three didn't make Chunin, he would go hunting for the reason why. Sasuke glared, not at anyone in particular, but he glared nonetheless. The inoffensive section of wall that was the victim of his attention ignored him, as was to be expected. Deep in his mind a faint and foreign whisper hissed at him that this power should have been his, that he would need it so he should take it, or find a way to. He shook his head, clearing away the thoughts as he pushed them into a mental corner. Apparently the third ring of seals was working, making him aware that the voice of greed and envy was in this case foreign to him. Yes, he wanted power and revenge, but more than anything, he wanted the freedom to choose, or it was all empty. What price had to be paid for this power? Where did it come from? Why did it exist, and why did he feel he needed a long, hot shower with lots of scrubbing when it brushed against his thoughts? Savagely, he devoured his meal and looked at, rather than glared in the general direction of, his teammates. They didn't have the same bond as Team 8, but they could build something. The meal over, the proctors signaled for the first two fighters to step into the stadium. Hiruzen had finally nailed it down. Keeping himself out from under whatever influence Danzo had been wielding was doing wonders for him, and a new visitor to the cage's box, seated on the opposite side from the cage, was giving him good news. I've had a look at that Iwa girl, and her sensei was willing to allow it, Sunade told him. Her condition was a result of a childhood trauma from before Ishiguma adopted her. Apparently he found her in a very interesting place, and couldn't bear to leave her to die. Since she was all stone, specifically marble, for so many years, no one knew her hair was red until we washed the marble dust out 20 minutes ago. Red? Hiruzen noted. Any particular shade of red? Tsunade grinned. Uzumaki red. He found the Hyaku Hoseki bloodline lying under a bush in Uzu no Kuni. If that gets back to Iwa, they're both doomed, she said. Hiruzen nodded. Good news indeed. He needed to speak with the Uzumaki clan head after this. Uzumaki Naruto vs Ginkumo Kura. Naruto had seen the previous fights of this Kura, and knew about his two techniques so far, the cat's cradle and the lightning step. Either alone was impressive, but both together would be killer. Sliding out his claws, and charging in, he attacked. The best defense he could think of was to keep his opponent too busy to throw around his kunai. Up close and fighting hard was not Kura's preferred method of combat, but he knew the tune and could dance to it. A kunai in each hand, parrying like crazy, and ducking and dodging as much as he could. He could see the scratches and grooves in the metal as he blocked. This was annoying. Of his mind's 5 paths, a trick he'd used for years, 3 were devoted to his defense, while the other 2 tried frantically to formulate a decent plan for victory. He'd seen the gravity seals, so if his opponent released those, he'd have no choices left. He saw the flaring of his opponent's nose. The clones he could use wouldn't work, then. As he used Hikawarimi no Jutsu to switch with a boulder, he took the few seconds he needed to catch his breath even as Naruto dragged his claws from the stone. His mind clicked, and Kura charged in, putting himself on the offensive. 2 parts for attack, 1 for defense, 1 for analysis, and 1 for planning. As the kunai and wires lashed around and about, he saw a hand seal being formed and paled. Taju Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. Naruto stood before him, all 50 of him, and all ready to fight. There was just no way he had enough wire or kunai to deal with all of them, and his opponent could, and likely would, use the substitution technique to bounce around the field. Uzumaki had his own equivalent of his lightning step, now, and worse. He wasn't even sweating, unlike the Kumo strategist, who was physically exhausted. He had 1 shot, 1 guess, and then he'd be swarmed. He raised his right hand above his head, and the kunai tumbled to the ground as he opened his fingers. "I yield the match," he declared. "Given time, I might be able to be you, with the right resources and preparation, but here and now, no chance." Naruto walked with the young man to the stairs as the proctor called the winner. As the 2 of them entered the doorway, they passed Hinata and Shino on their way to the stadium floor. As Naruto paused to hug his Hinata tight, murmuring his love for her, and shook his other teammate's hand, Kura saw the bond, one not unlike his with his sisters, and knew where Naruto's weakness lay. But he caught Naruto's eye as he did, and the vicious promise that lay behind it. Hurting, or the 1001 kami forbid, killing one of this shinobi's precious people would destroy the man. But no one wanted to deal with the monster that would replace him. As for the thought of killing the girl, Kura shuddered. Might as well set fire to the world and be done. He spotted Fukuro and their sensei, and approached them quietly. This was important intelligence for their mission. The Raikage must want them dead. In the stands, a ninja in the Anbu cloak and mask slipped a little closer to where Team 7 sat, and glanced around. This might be a problem. He was good, but was he good enough to face Copycat, Kakashi, Illusion Queen, Kuranai and, oh no, not her, please anyone but her, Enko? Not without a major distraction, and setting off his signal would be a dead giveaway, an invitation for them to hit him hard. He needed to wait. Aburame Shino vs Hyuga Hinata. Shino knew he wouldn't have much time. Hinata had developed her gentle storm even further than he'd have dreamed possible if she'd integrated a third element into the style. He unleashed the full force of his colonies. The second Hayate said, Hajime. He channeled earth chakra through them, allowing the Kakaichu to become far stronger and sturdier than any insect should be, and rushed in. Hinata's weakness used to be that she had smaller reserves and less endurance than others, but if she was training under a gravity seal, that changed things. Especially since he didn't remember her reactivating it after her last fight. Still, he had a few surprises of his own. As he swept his fist around, Hinata jumped back enough to avoid him, but when his Kakaichu formed a fist in the shadow of his own, passing just behind and outside his own swing, she was caught by surprise and struck in the ribs. UNFF, she grunted, and then spoke up. Good one, Shino. What do you call it? He pushed his glasses back up his nose. I was thinking, bug shadow boxing, but it doesn't feel right. I'll get back to you. She nodded as she took a new stance, loosely based on the Gentle Fist's 8 trigrams, and Shino's eyes widened behind his glasses, taking in every detail, including her just activated Byakugan, which meant that his first flurry had been avoided without the heightened perception of the Hyuga Dujutsu. As she began to spin and strike, apparently wildly to those in the stands, he felt his Kakaichu fall, one by one, until all he could feel were his two queens. The Kakaichu of the Aburame were somewhat unique that way, in that queens could coexist if their hosts were strong and focused enough. He didn't feel the other insects die though, he realized as they fell. Hinata was reaching out in an incredibly precise and focused application of her chakra and tapping at the tiny beetle's chakra across empty space up to 15 feet of distance, to knock out his Kakaichu without killing them. Something no other Hyuga would have managed. As he took a half step back, she was suddenly right there thrusting her palm against his solar plexus and letting him feel the chakra she could have unleashed into him. Proctor, he called out. I yield. That last blow could have delivered sufficient force to injure me severely, and destroy my colonies and queens. I have lost. He bowed politely to his teammate. Congratulations, Hinata-chan, he said. Now go hug your fiancé while I gather my Kakaichu. The Aburame were impressed, both by Shino's taijutsu modification, and by his teammates' concern for his Kakaichu, rendering the insects incapacitated where a little more force and chakra would have eliminated them completely. Team 8 was certainly a team to keep an eye on, nor were they alone in this regard, with Hyuga Hiyashi sitting straighter and more proud of his eldest daughter with every second. Although not so proud as to not keep an eye on the stands as much as the stadium. That would have been quite silly after he'd received that message from Hisashi's old teammate. A simple origami crane didn't seem like much of a warning, but the gray paper with the white backing was one nonetheless, so he watched the failed Kumo ninja, not too far away. HSST. Sakura, Naruto hissed, catching the pink-haired girl's attention. As she approached him, warily, she was astounded as he sketched a quick bow. Thanks for the tip-off about the CRA, he told her. In return, I've got a suggestion for you. Think, carefully, and answer honestly. Do you still want Sasuke to notice you? Her glare was answer enough, he thought. Thought so. Now, you watch Sasuke more than almost anyone else I know, so think, does he like fangirls? Sakura shook her head, and glanced over her shoulder. Sasuke had been distracted lately, likely by that curse mark. He hadn't noticed their conversation, and if they kept the volume low, he wouldn't. Of course not, she hissed, well aware that her crush considered her part of that horde, just smarter. What do all these girls have in common? What are they doing, that he can't stand? Naruto's questions were really hitting home, and Sakura was getting uncomfortable about this line of questioning. They constantly chase him and praise him, he doesn't want that. Now she thought about it, that was pretty much behavior that guaranteed them not to be noticed by him. So you should do something different. I'm not saying ditch him or forget about him. He held up both hands as she clenched her fists. But it looks to me that if you really want him to choose you, you have to make him chase after you. He respects strength, get stronger, and show him how you did it. Share what you learn, without asking, and maybe he'll do the same. See ya. He darted away as Hinata came up the stairs, hugging her and giving her that light affectionate kiss that Sakura envied. Looking over at Sasuke, she made up her mind, but no one was ever going to learn that she'd taken relationship advice from Naruto. Sunade nodded as Jiraiya stepped past her. Whoever that was in the cage's box, they were wearing dead flesh over their own, part of a jutsu Orochimaru had been experimenting with before he fled the village. Jiraiya on the other was shaking his head. There had been no sign of Danzo for the entire day, which meant that he knew something was up, and wanted it to take place. A damning attitude. Making sure the Hokage was never alone was a good plan, but keeping it subtle enough to not set off their former teammates' warning bells was trickier. Nusuma Suzume versus Yanagi Tenten. As the young weapons mistress leapt backwards, her hands filled with kunai that she'd launched blindly in the general direction of her opponent, she was remembering the training her dad, adopted as she may be, that was who he was to her, had given her, along with several pieces of advice. The first piece was already in use. Close only counts with horseshoes and exploding tags. He'd said, so exploding tags covered the kunai she'd just thrown and the resulting gouts of dirt and rock and smoke obscured the area. The second item was next as she hurled packets of glass marbles and fragile bells across a large area inside the smoke, building a quick picture with the sounds that came from within as the Kumo genin was struck by either, and sending more kunai in. Finally his last adage was put to use. There is no overkill, only, open fire, and, I have no ammunition left. Twin rising dragons. Her two storage scrolls began to release weapon after weapon after weapon towards her foe, still unseen, as Tenten's leap continued to carry her upwards. The dirt and dust was settling by the time Tenten landed from her jump, and the masses of steel had formed a very sharp and dangerous web with the other girl at the center. Scratches and cuts here and there, including a kunai in one thigh and a chain and javelin through the opposite arm. Pinned to the ground by her own clothes. A panicked expression on her face. As the proctor called the match, Suzume began breathing again. The girl had not held back, and hadn't given her time to use a genjutsu, and rightly so. If she'd given her even an instant of breathing room, Suzume's most dangerous genjutsu, the Sen Ten Yumi, or Thousand Heavenly Dreams, would have had her. What made it so dangerous was that the victim didn't want to break it. She had been overmatched and overwhelmed in what may have been the only way for the Konoha Kunoichi to win. She noted that this one was the one who hung around with that Hyuga boy from earlier. If they were strong like this as genin aiming for Chunin, what must their jonin be capable of? Maybe Kura was right. Again, damn it. The Kage frowned beneath his hat and veil. Something was wrong. That mix-up with the signals had been a horrible oversight, but not one he could do anything about. Outwardly, he was a little upset. After all, Suna's monster was the only genin left, and there weren't as many people here to witness his victory as he might have liked. His old teammates were both here as well. That blasted experiment not only didn't die, but got so strong it wasn't funny, and had found teammates that seemed to match his own potential. Worse, although he'd felt the chakra of the Ichibi clearly in Gaara's slaughter of that Iwa boy, he'd not even felt a flicker of the Kyuubi. A worrisome thing, as it meant that the experiment was that strong without it. He'd not have believed anyone could create that many shadow clones. Even the Yondaime's limit had been 20 or so. He glanced towards the other spectators. This had never been intended to get to the semifinals, and as the board revealed the next match, Orochimaru nearly howled in frustration. With no Uchiha, this would be a waste of time unless he could destroy Konoha. His original plans were trashed. If Kabuto didn't give the signal, he would. And to Jigoku with the costs. Sabaku no Gaara vs Uzumaki Naruto. Gaara rode his sand, a disc of it forming beneath him and lifting him down to the stadium floor, while Naruto jumped over the railing, dragging his claws down the wall, striking 6 trails of sparks as he went, gouging shallow furrows in the wall as he went. As they took their positions, Gaara turned to his opponent. Mother is happy, she will finally have your blood, so we mustn't waste a single drop. The Suna Jinchuriki's killing intent skyrocketed, an immense emotional pressure that everyone in the stands felt, a terrible, inhuman hatred for everything, a presence that would happily light the fires just to see the world burn. No one was immune, even Orochimaru felt it, and for a brief period of rational sanity, wondered if this plan had not been thought out very well. As the monstrous feeling washed outwards, those trained to leaned into it, for lack of a better term, flaring their own chakra within themselves to resist it. Naruto ignored it, bolstered from within by the Kyuubi, inured to such a presence by dint of having one inside him already. A vulpine grin crossed his face as he released his gravity seal and discarded his weights, leaning his scroll against the wall. Then he stood taking his low, loose stance, but with a difference to it. His claws were out, and low touching the ground with his hands open, palm upwards, as though holding a sphere the size of a baseball. His elbows were bent as he braced for combat, and his eyes were on his opponent as Hayate yelled, "Hajime," and ran for it. Gaara's sand lashed out, faster than anyone could believe, a lance of it thrusting to pierce Naruto's side, but the boy slashed across the incoming sand with his claws, and called, "Arashi no Sume." Claws of the storm, as he did, and the resulting spray scattered the sandy spear wide as the blonde Jinchuriki spun around what was left of the tendril and lashed out at Gaara's arm. A wall of sand sprang up between them, spraying back onto Gaara at the 3 points of impact, but holding, and spikes shot from the wall to attack Naruto. Taking a few hits to the arms, hits he ignored, pushing the pain to one side, Naruto struck again, and when the sand countered him, attacked those. The red-haired Jinchuriki was in heaven, the voice inside him cackling with insane glee as the other boy's blood flew, but the injuries closed too quickly and the exchange of blows was taking too long. He tapped into the yellow chakra of the monster inside him, just a little, to make the sand faster and struck, spiraling several tendrils around his enemy and trapping him in a great mass of sand. Sand coffin, his harsh whisper, somehow clearly audible to everyone in the stands, announced his enemy's fate, and every one of Naruto's friends and enemies, rivals and allies stood and watched closer. Orochimaru smiled with glee. Almost time, then. He could wait a few minutes to let the shock and despair on Hirazen's face take hold. Hirazen lifted one hand, wishing he could stop this, but by the time he acted, Hiyashi paled, and Hanabi with him. Hinata would be devastated. Kurenai had her fist in her mouth and was barely holding back tears and screams. Kabuto savored the brat's imminent demise, ignoring his target no 10 feet away. There were only 3 people who did not react in the slightest, who could see what was happening. Kakashi, frozen to the spot with shock. Sasuke, fighting the roar of the curse mark to take vengeance for Naruto's death, and Hinata. The girl stared at the sand her fiancé had disappeared into, and whispered. "You promised me, Naruto. You know our Nindo. Keep it." In the stadium below, Gaara closed his outstretched hand crying out with joy and triumph as he did. Sand burial.